Good afternoon. My name is Ala McCoy. I'm Director of Startup Support at the University of Maryland Young Ventures. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who joined us today for the next installment in Startup Fundamentals Workshop Series. This series is offered by UM Ventures with collaboration from Maryland Technology Enterprise Institute and Dingman Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Maryland. To everyone attending the live session, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function. You can usually find it at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this session and will be posted on our Startup PMD YouTube channel. You may submit your questions anonymously if you wish to do so. So today's session will be led by experienced technology transfer professionals from our UM Ventures team, who will discuss very important issues surrounding open source software. I'd like to welcome our speakers. Felicia Metz is the Associate Director of UM Ventures College Park. Felicia advises on patent prosecution, IP portfolio development, and licensing issues. Felicia received her BS in Biological Sciences from the University of Maryland and her JD magna cum laude from the University of Baltimore School of Law. She is a member of the Maryland Bar and is registered to practice before the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And I would like to also add that she is probably the most senior in terms of time and knowledge member of our team. Welcome, Felicia. Virenci Jutakanda is an innovation manager at UM Ventures College Park. Prior to joining UM Ventures, Virenci worked as an intern at the Center for Technology Transfer and Commercialization in Vanderbilt University, where he also earned his bachelor's degree in computer engineering. Virenci is also a TERP and recently earned master's degree in, what's the degree, Virenci? At the University of Maryland College Park.
Information management.
Thank you. And Virenci has been with the University of Maryland how long now?
A little over 7 years.
Little over 7 years doing licensing in information sciences and software. Thank you. And Michael Robel, a senior manager, intellectual property at UM Ventures. Michael is an attorney with expertise in software, AI, open source, and other areas of IP law. So thank you so much. I made this really brief introduction. You can add if you wish. And we can begin shortly. To everyone in the session, please submit your questions via the Q&A at the bottom. I will be able to unmute your mics at the end of the presentation if you would like, but please do remember that we are recording the session. It will be posted on YouTube. So thank you so much, and why don't we delve into the issues of open source licensing.
Thanks, Ala, and we're happy to take questions as we go along too, so this can be more of a discussion than just us talking at you. This topic was prompted today by a recent IP waiver memo that came out from our Vice President for Research, which I'll talk a little bit later about what prompted that, but we thought it would be good to just do an overview of what is open source. So we're going to talk today about open source basics, what is an open source license, types of licenses, the sort that we recommend for university software, open source business models, how if you are interested in creating a company but also want to release something open source, or you have or are incorporating something as part of your academic work and research, how the open source models can interface with protecting IP and coming up with a product that is protectable, some best practices and considerations, and then a little bit about the university policies and procedures around IP and open source releases. So an open source license, I think often gets confused with putting something out in the public domain, but an open source license is a type of license that attaches to copyright code. So copyright as an intellectual property right protects original works of authorship in any tangible medium, and software code is protected by copyright. And when it comes to administering or protecting your rights as the copyright owner, as the owner of copyright, you have the right to reproduce, prepare derivatives, distribute copies, perform, display, transmit. And if you want to grant permission to someone else to exploit some or all of those rights, that's what a license is. And I tend to think of licenses for intellectual property similarly to real property. So you own a house and you want to rent out your basement, you would have someone sign a lease. A lease is akin to a license, and so that tenant can exploit rights to that property for a limited period of time for limited purposes. And that's the same as a license for intellectual property. An open source license is still a license, but it gives very permissive rights to users and licensees of that code, of that software. So with an open source license, the owner of the copyright still retains copyright, but is granting very generous permissions. Open source licenses allows code to be copied, used, modified, distributed under certain requirements, generally things like attribution. In some instances, the same license has to flow down to derivative works, which we'll get into more details later in the discussion. But I think it's helpful to remember public domain does not mean open source. So if you have code and you just post on your website with no claim of copyright, no license language included, then you could potentially be putting something into the public domain, which means you have no copyright. Anyone can exploit it without attribution, without any other requirements. Why a license matters in open source. So it protects certain rights of the licensor, the owner. Having a license helps control risks. And again, with open source, the creators or authors still have copyright in the software, and the license specifies what rights a licensor may choose to retain and protect. A license provides clarification, clarity on what the licensee can and can't do, what their responsibilities are if they're using that licensed IP, that code. And having open source use often can lower risks for licensees. You might, if you're already familiar in this space, you might have heard the terms permissive or copyleft license. It's a kind of a spectrum of how open source licenses are categorized. So permissive licenses, generally then the code can be modified, copied, incorporated then into proprietary software. Examples of permissive licenses, MIT, BSD 3 clause, Apache 2.0, which Virinci is going to talk about in more detail. Copyleft has some more requirements to them. So as an example, any derivative can't be or must be distributed under the same license. So you might have to release the code and include the same open source license attached to that derivative code. And various GPL licenses would be considered copyleft licenses. There's other types of open licenses that apply to IP other than software. So you may be familiar with Creative Commons licenses. These are non-software open licenses. And there are other licenses available for more things like devices. But the focus of this talk will be on open source licenses for code, for software. And I'm going to hand it over to Virinci to talk about more specifics with open source licenses.
Thanks, Alicia. So in this section, we're going to talk about 4 common open source licenses, starting with the most permissive license and then going over to copyleft license. So the first one off the bat is the MIT license. If you can click next slide. So it's a very simple license. This is the entirety of it. And you can see it has just 4 paragraphs. The first one is the copyright notice that's included as part of the license. If you go to the next one, sorry, one more previous. Right, so this is the in the middle. There's right there. this is the license grant. So this is what rights you are granting to anybody that is wanting to, use, copy, modify, so forth, the software that you're going to be releasing under this license. And anybody who it also gets a copy of that from the intermediary. The next section there just says the condition that the copyright notice and this license needs to be included in any copies of the software that's distributed or any significant or substantial portions of the software. And then the last section is certain limitations. So the software released under the license doesn't have any warranty, doesn't have any liability to the authors. And we can go to the next one. So these are just examples of projects that have been released under the MIT license, and you'll notice there are a lot of software libraries that are used in development. So Ruby on Rails, Node.js, the .NET framework from Microsoft, and so forth. The next license here is the BSD 3-clause clear license. BSD in this case stands for Berkeley Software Distribution. It's not really a coincidence that two of the more permissive licenses in open source both have their roots from universities. This is the license that the university likes to use, and I'll get into that in a bit. So you can see it allows commercial and private use. You can distribute the source code or the binary code, and you can modify both instances of that code as well. The conditions for this license, similar to MIT, a copyright notice lists the conditions, and the disclaimer for warranties must be included when the software is redistributed. And the limits are also similar. So no liability or warranty with this license. It does not allow patent use. And you can't use the names of the authors or the creators for any type of endorsement or promotions. And those latter 2 points are part of why we prefer to use it here at the university. This is a very permissive license, so we can distribute freely. People can come and modify it, but there are certain protections, especially with patent rights and the use of the university's name, that we want to protect. And so that's why we prefer to use this license when we can. And these are just some examples of other products that have been released under various BSD licenses. There's variants like the 2-clause and the 4-clause. But LevelDB is a type of database. Quill is a text editor, and D3.js is a Java script library for web development. Apache 2.0 is also another popular license. This one is also a permissive license, and you'll notice a lot of open source licenses don't really restrict what you can and can't use something for. So you'll see they all allow commercial use, private use, distribution, modification, and so forth. The difference between Apache and some of the other permissive licenses is that this one actually does allow patent use. The conditions that come with this one, similar to the others, you have to include the copyright notice and a copy of the license. One thing unique about this one is that you have to state changes for any modifications that you make.
I'm going to jump in real quick, Verinci, since you're talking about whether patent use is allowed or not. So when we're talking about software and open source licenses is just for the copyright rights. So copyright protects the code itself, but not the underlying functionality of what the software does. And that's the purview of patents. So you could have software where you have one or more patents that protect the process, what it is that the software does, and then the code itself, which is protected by copyright. So often a product will have multiple types of IP rights associated with it. The open source licenses is for the code, but as Apache 2.0 as an example, also includes automatic grants to use any related patent rights as well.
Thanks, Alicia. So these are just a couple of examples of projects under Apache 2. So Android, specifically the user space, is covered under Apache 2.0. Swift, the programming language that Apple created, and Kubernetes, which is the container software for cloud computing. And the last one that we're going to cover today is the GPL license 3.0. This one is a copyleft license, so a lot more restrictive than the more permissive licenses that we just discussed. And you can see what it allows is pretty similar to Apache, but the conditions are a bit different. So you have to disclose the source code for any modifications that you make. Similarly, you have to include copyright notice and the copy of the license. You have to state any changes that you make to software that is under this license. And perhaps the most consequential is you have to release any modifications or derivative works under the same license. So you would have to release it under GPL 3.0. And as with the other licenses, it also has a limit on liability and warranty for the authors. And as an example, so Android, the kernel part of Android is actually released under GPL 3.0. And then you can see Bash, which is a command line interface and programming language within Unix, and GIMP, which is a image editor, are all under GPL.
And besides these kind of standard open source licenses, it's also possible to create kind of custom licenses when you want to post something or release something under very permissive terms. And our office can help with that. And we have a question in the chat about including a reference in your code to open source code used in it. Do you need to include the whole thing? For example, 4 paragraphs in the MIT license. So if the license for code you're incorporating requires that the license flow down, then you need to include the whole license to it. Does that answer your question? I don't know if that answers your question, or if it's more for like identifying for the copy left which specific code is the original. Thomas, if you want to clarify that. Okay, thanks.
I think we have another question in the chat.
How can you monetize? So Ahmad, we're going to get into talking about how more about business models and how where you do have a product that has open source code incorporated, how it can be commercialized.
Right. So like Felicia mentioned, we can do custom licenses as well. And by no means is the 4 that we talked about a comprehensive list. There are dozens and dozens of different open source licenses out there. Those are just the 4 of the popular ones that we tend to see most common. So in this section, we're going to talk about license compatibility a little bit. And this comes up when you're potentially working on a project or you're incorporating open source software into something that you're working on. And those software packages might be covered under different licenses. So what happens when you have licenses that don't necessarily play well together? So here's a chart that was created by David Wheeler and his team, and it shows essentially a flow down of how licenses can interoperate with each other, where the most permissive licenses are out to the left, and then it gets more restrictive or more copy left as you go right. And the arrows in this chart are one directional. So as an example, MIT is compatible with BSD 3 clause and pretty much anything else that comes after it. But if you look at GPL 3.0, it's not really compatible with a lot of the licenses here on this chart. So that's one thing to consider when you're coming up with these projects, or if you're working on an open source project, is what are the terms that you need to consider when you're working on this project? How are the licenses that you are going to be working with going to be affecting your project, either upstream or downstream of what you're working on? So there are cases where you might want to consider mixing licenses. So as we just mentioned, Android as an example for both Apache and GPL. So in the user space for Android, that is released under Apache, which is more permissive. And in that case, you might want to consider a more permissive license, because this is where applications are going to be running. And so you might want to give developers flexibility and not have them worry about whether or not they're going to have to release the code that they develop under GPL. But for something like the kernel OS, which is the guts of the operating system, Google might still want to retain some level of control over it. So if anybody makes changes to the operating system, then it might make more sense to put that under a more restrictive license like GPL 3.0. Oftentimes, sorry, one more bullet point on that one. So oftentimes you'll hear copyleft licenses be called viral licenses, not because they're popular, but they might tend to infect or contaminate software code that is developed privately. And that can have consequences, especially if you're developing something downstream from a license like that. Oftentimes, industry especially might be hesitant if they're incorporating something that's been released under a copyleft license into something that they are working on closed source. And so that's also another consideration to keep in mind when you're working on these sorts of projects. Right, so we just talked about the interoperability. So the importance of making sure that your licenses are compatible, in addition to interoperability, is also legal risk, right? So what exactly are you getting yourself into when you're bringing on these types of third-party software into your projects? We saw the limits that some of these licenses can have. You need to be aware of these risks that you're taking on when you're developing open source projects like these. The other thing to think about is community development, right? So if you have a project that you want to release so that other people can contribute and develop, they also need to be aware of what their obligations are going to be as contributors or developers, because it'll affect whatever projects that they're working on as well. And this is just a quick recap of the 4 licenses that we've discussed, along with the uses, the rights, and the other features that we talked about. So you can find similar tables in Wikipedia that are more comprehensive, or there's a appropriately named website called choosealicense.com that has an appendix of open source licenses and has a similar table to this. So. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Felicia.
Thanks, Fringy. I just want to talk briefly then about the university's policies and procedures and guidelines when it comes to releasing something under an open source license. So we know that researchers tend to make decisions on their own of how things get released and when things get released. But we want you to come and talk to us to make sure the license you're picking makes sense. And that you're able to release it under an open source license. So under our university's intellectual property policy for software, in addition to inventions, the university owns that IP that's made under sponsored research using funds that you get through the foundation. So for example, if a company is giving you a gift and you use it to create code, write software, using that money, the university would own it. Or if there's any other contract or agreement in place that says the university needs to own this software. And the reason why the policy has us own rights and software made under sponsored research agreements is because the university, in order to sign and accept, we need to own the rights for IP that arise in the project. And so we have a process in place where if someone wants to release new proprietary code under an open source license, or even put it in the public domain or assign it to somebody else, there's an IP waiver request, since we're waiving something in the IP policy, since under the IP policy, our office, UM Ventures, we're the ones with authority to decide how university IP is licensed and distributed and disseminated. And recently, with a lot of requirements that we're now seeing many federal agencies, NASA being one, put into their RFPs, where they want to see proposals where you are planning to release something in an open repository, whether it's data or code itself, instead of requiring an IP waiver for every single one of these proposals. That's why the VPR did a blanket waiver to administratively cut down on steps here at the university. We still want to be able to track and know what's being released. And so that's why there's still some checkboxes you have to fill out as a PI when you route your proposal in Koali. But as long as you're following those guidelines, it's for these specific types of awards, we don't need to process the IP waiver request. If there are other requests to release university-owned code under an open source license, then still make the IP waiver request, and that comes through Kuali to our office, and we review it and make sure that you're getting the right guidance, the license you've picked makes sense, that there's no other contractual restrictions that would prohibit the release or any commercialization plans. We want to make sure that the open source release aligns with any commercialization plans as well. And so if you have questions about who has authority to release, if you need to sign something, I know like contributing to Apache, there's an agreement to sign. Our office should be signing off on those agreements if needed. So please just contact us with any questions. If you're unsure if something is university owned or not, whether your code is university owned or whether it falls under traditional scholarly work that researchers hold copyright in themselves, please reach out and let us know, and we'll work with you to figure it out. And I think that's all I have on the policy. Didn't want to get too in the weeds on that. Some considerations, again, for deciding both whether to incorporate, if you're going to incorporate open source code into something new you're working on, or whether to release something. Think, what are the goals for the project? Who's the audience? Who are the ultimate users? With the third-party software you might be using, what licenses attached? I'd go back to that nice flowchart Verinchy included to figure out what restrictions you might need to consider. What we look at too is, are there any other agreements involved? So if you're wanting to release existing code under an open source license, I'll ask, was this created under a sponsored research agreement or a contract? And I'll double check and just make sure there's no terms that would be contrary to the type of release that you want to do and impact on commercialization. I think there's a question then about, how do you then monetize? How do you figure out financial terms? Perhaps Verinchy or Michael can talk a little bit more about this later. But I think it is possible to have a licensing model, and we've had this with some of our university licensees, where the company plans to release some service or a product where the code is open, but then they might have another offering where the code is not open, and the product is really kept more proprietary and are charging, say, for a service rather than sharing the code. One thing I want to mention too, many donors to the university, instead of going the sponsored research route, like to give gifts, and then they request that if you use money from their gift in creating code, that they want you to release it under specific open source licenses, which to me I don't think is quite appropriate. They're giving a gift. There shouldn't be any requirements. The companies are able to do that, since in theory, it's not just a direct financial benefit to their company, that it could benefit all. But I think in reality, that might be, the donor company might be the only company that would benefit from having this particular code open. So again, if a donor is requesting that and you're unsure what the implications for that are, please talk to us as well. And now I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk more about business models, best practices, and compliance.
Thank you, Felicia. And thank you all for joining today. We have a very entrepreneurial, innovative culture at the University of Maryland. In fact, Maryland ranks as a top 5 school in entrepreneurship. Along those lines, I will provide a general overview of business models based on open source software. So if you have a business idea and can code, or know someone who can code, you just may have the next great startup. As you will see, there are many potential ways to use open source as part of your business strategy. Next slide, please. So before we dive in, let's take a moment to honor those who share their work via open source for the benefit of society. Here we have Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web in 1989. Berners-Lee believed that the web needed to be unfettered so that innovators could build on top of it. Lucky for us, he convinced his employer to release the World Wide Web into the public domain without any patents or restrictions. Today, we have all benefited from this single decision. Next slide, please. In 1991, Linus Torvalds studied computer science at the University of Helsinki. At that time, commercial Unix operating systems were too expensive for regular users. Frustrated, Torvalds set out to develop a free operating system as a hobby. Today, over 30 years later, almost all major websites run on Linux. 500 of the world's fastest supercomputers run on Linux. And thanks to Android, Linux is the most popular end-user operating system. I start with these examples so that we all realize and understand the power that open source has. Next slide, please. So today, a variety of business models have been built on open source software. As you can see, nonprofits, venture-backed startups, private firms, and public companies all have benefited from open source. Next slide, please. So turning to our first business model, this is the support, services, and maintenance model, often called the Red Hat model, who perfected it. So Red Hat, if you haven't heard of them, sells subscriptions for support, training, and services to help customers use their enterprise products, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So in short, customers pay one price and they get unlimited access to the Red Hat network and 24/7 support. As you may know, IBM acquired Red Hat in 2019 for $34 billion, when Red Hat's annual revenues were at $3.4 billion per year. Next slide. So now we'll talk about the dual license model, and this refers to open sourcing software under two different licenses. So in one example, the same software, right, same code base may be licensed under a limited academic, personal, non-commercial license, right, for non-commercial use. And then it'll be available also under commercial licenses for business. Sometimes a strong copyleft will be used in conjunction with the commercial license. This is because the strong copyleft license encourages businesses to obtain a commercial license. As I think Felicia and Vinci noted, most businesses do not want to expose their proprietary source code to copyleft obligations. Next slide. This might be my favorite model because it's called the widget frosty model. And very briefly, it's a hardware company that sells hardware and provides open source software as a value add-on. So here we have Arduino, and they produce microcontrollers and microcontroller kits. The tinkerers and hobbyists use these boards to design and build devices that interact with the real world. Some example projects include an automated plant watering system, a motion-activated alarm, and an ultrasonic distance sensor. And I believe Ferenczi mentioned that this hardware is open source under Creative Commons license. The software, the value add that's provided for free to drive hardware sales, that's licensed under the Lesser GNU General Public License, LGPL, and the GPL. And next slide, please. So what I really found cool about Arduino is that the company offers their own version of simplified C++ and a software development environment for their users to build code and use the libraries. So now we'll talk about the crowdfunding and donations model. And as you can see, Arduino also accepts donations to fund and support their open source efforts specifically. Other foundations will, and nonprofit organizations will solicit donations from individuals and corporate sponsors. These donations support open source development and related initiatives. And I'm sure we've all used Wikipedia and at times have seen its donation requests. So now turning to the open core model, that's where a company provides two versions of the software. So maybe a basic version of the software, a core and feature limited version that's released as free and open source software, a bare bones version with no bells and whistles, And then they'll have a more enhanced commercial version of the software that they provide for a fee. Now, the commercial versions are usually going to include significant features for corporate customers, such as increased scalability, third-party integration, improved security, and faster performance. Next slide, please. So sometimes open source is delivered over the web as software as a service. I'm sure we've seen websites built on WordPress. So WordPress is a content management system that allows people to build and host websites. The underlying source code is available to all of us as open source under a GPL license. Now, WordPress.com offers this software to its users via a website. This makes sense because most users and small businesses are more interested in generating content than standing up and running their own servers. As you can see, there are a few different subscription options available, including a free version for limited use. Next slide. To expand upon the SaaS model, some companies also provide platforms as a service that are built on top of open source. So in the Databricks example, Databricks was founded by the original creators of Apache Spark, an open source project. Among other things, the company offers a web-based platform and automated cluster management for Spark. And next slide. So now we're going to talk about two different complementary open source models. And we've all heard of Google. We've all used Google search. Google strategically open sourced Android for free to incentivize widespread adoption by device manufacturers, right? Google has their own hardware. That's a picture of the Pixel 8 there. Android also runs on other devices like Samsung hardware. So this enabled Google to capture a substantial user base rather easily. And keep in mind, still over 3/4 of Google's revenue comes from advertising. So this adoption, driving more users into the Google ecosystem, means more users engaging with ads, which means higher revenue for Google. So this was a great move on Google's part. And now another familiar name, Apple. In 2015, Apple released the Swift programming language as open source. In case you're wondering, there's no affiliation with Taylor Swift. Swift is just really fast, supposedly over 8 times faster than Python. Swift has become the most prominent and preferred programming language for iOS app development, right? The App Store. Open sourcing Swift encouraged adoption of the language and strengthened Apple's developer community. Say, well, so what? Well, the result in 2022, App Store developers generated 1.1 trillion in total billings and sales in the App Store ecosystem. So here, in the last model we'll look at is proprietary software with open source components. And this is how open source is mainly used in commerce. And companies use open source very carefully and strategically, often with permissively licensed open source, to build applications better, faster, and cheaper than if everything had to be created from scratch. If we look really closely, we can find open source attribution notices in the software products that we use every day. Now they may be buried. Next slide, please. Let's see. Yeah, and we have those attributions can be in acknowledgements, legal notices, documentation, file folders. Excuse my amateur photography. I just decided to see if I could find the attributions in my Apple TV. So I dug down into legal and regulatory, looked at the acknowledgements. There was a long, long list of acknowledgements. And as you can see there, Apple is acknowledging use of a component under the MIT license. And I think someone had a question before about whether the entire license needs to be included. And I think the answer generally is yes, that's the best practice and would be required by every license. Although not all about absolutes, but I can't remember or recall any particular license that only a portion of it needed to be included.
So I think there were a couple of questions in the chat earlier about, how to charge, how to monetize. And I hope these examples show that there's not a one size fits all. And for the university, for us, when we're evaluating our IP, trying to get things licensed, working with, say, a faculty entrepreneur who has already released university-owned code under an open source license, we want to make sure that that release was done appropriately, evaluate and strategically figure out what do we have left, what's the business model, and we can be creative then with how the university is compensated for its license grant to that company for whatever they're producing, selling, charging for.
That's right. These are not the only business models. They're only examples, and they can be combined in various fashions. And the only limit is our imagination. So there are many ways to incorporate open source software into a business model. And the most important thing to ensure is that your open source license fits with your business strategy. As you can see, each of these businesses has a slightly different objectives and uses their license to match their business objectives. So, general advice, if you wish to promote adoption, permissive licenses could be useful. And if you're seeking to maintain tight control over a project, a copyleft license may be useful to consider.
There's a question, is UMD's preference for BSD over MIT related to downstream patent protection? Yes.
Yeah, so we picked that one because it explicitly, BSD 3 clause clear explicitly does not allow patent rights as part of the license.
And I think, please do talk to us and just figuring out what license to pick. I think often in an academic environment, authors aren't thinking about downstream uses, maybe not thinking about what companies might then take the code and incorporate it into something, where those companies are located, what countries they're in. And so being careful on how you post things, what licenses are included, I think can end up being important. And we're here to help avoid those issues.
Next slide. There you go. So some open source considerations and some thought for license selection. I mean, be cognizant of these requirements that are coming up with sponsored awards. We've heard about them in the government sense. I know other universities have had those requirements with commercially sponsored work. There was, on that note, with that question about encumbering the patent portfolio, releasing open source on a public server can impact patent rights. That will count as a public disclosure. Many countries have absolute novelty, and that would destroy patent rights in those countries. Other countries, like the United States, have a 1-year grace period. So before releasing something open source, I would recommend talking with our office to make sure that we have a strategy in place on how we want to proceed. And not just in a sense of public disclosures and losing patent rights, but we may be granting patent licenses if releases are done on behalf of the university. We might be granting patent licenses to our portfolio. So we want to look at our open source releases very carefully.
And a reminder too, that under our policies, if it's university-owned IP, licenses have to be granted from UM Ventures, not individual authors or inventors.
That's right. When selecting a license, choose one that fits your objectives and keep the big picture in mind in terms of how the software might be used downstream. You want to make sure the license that you select is compatible with the other open source you're integrating into your project. If you license something permissively, really think carefully about integrating copyleft, because that combined work, the resulting work, might not be permissive anymore. It might be under copyleft license, which is not the license you selected. Consider policies and requirements of your collaborators, whether that's another university or a commercial entity. They each have their own policies and procedures. Probably
Or
better.
even here at the university. So if you have students working on something and you're not paying them, they could potentially be individual joint owners with you or the university, and that can complicate matters. So to make sure expectations are clear up front, how you're paying students to do work, things like that are really important, because the more owners there are on something, the more complicated managing it can be.
Maybe keep track of the owners so that if you decide to make a change with the open source somewhere down the line, you know who was involved, you know who to contact. Keep in mind, the more folks that are involved, the trickier it might get. It might be harder to maintain control of the work, like if it's an individual student that's brought in. Keep an inventory of the open source that you're using on your project. Use a scanning tool if you have access to one. Otherwise, keep a list manually. Make sure that the team knows about that and that open source is worked into the software development process. Make sure you also honor the obligations of the open source that you integrate into your work, right? Open source is free, meaning we don't have to fork over money. However, it comes with strings, and make those acknowledgments. Be cautious of copyleft requirements, because there are actions that are brought, and open source is global, and sometimes those actions are brought in foreign countries. So we want to keep everybody safe, and to do that, make sure we're making the acknowledgments that we need to.
So please do, if you have more questions, please let us know. We have a website. You can find those of us in the office. I think most people are also on this call too. Our email addresses as well. Michael and Verinci both have a lot of experience working in this space and are great resources. We also have links to the university's IP policy, the Choose a License. I think their appendix has a really nice chart that lists all the licenses, color codes, what the terms are. Other university resources, the Innovation Gateway, links to various entrepreneurship resources on campus.
Thank you so much. This has been very informative. I hope that the attendees found it very informative. If you have any additional questions, feel free to also, at this point, you can raise your digital hand. There's a button at the bottom of your screen that says raise your hand, and I can unmute your mic if you'd like to ask your question that way. Just to keep in mind that we are recording this and we'll be posting it on YouTube. So I have a kind of a dumb question. You could answer that. So I've written software, I've written code. How do I actually attach, or how do I declare that I chose a specific license? What do I do?
So let me share this. So if you own it, you would, well, one, you'd put a copyright notice, copyright Alan McCoy, 2024. You would select a license, you'd save it in your root folder, and make sure you include copyright notice in the source code headers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
And how do I know if I own it or somebody else owns it?
So if you've done, you're a university employee, talk to us to figure out if under a policy you have an assignment obligation to the university or not, or if you've done this as consulting elsewhere, the terms of whatever agreements are should control. If you've done something on your own without using university significant resources, not under any funding agreement, then likely you own it personally if you've written something from scratch. But if you're consulting for somebody else, you have another job someplace, you'd want to check the terms of your employment agreements to see who would have rights to that IP.
Thank you. This is great. Any other questions? Not as dumb as mine. But that's the reason I asked is that's usually the most common misconceptions or questions. So we will be, I will follow up with everyone. And once the video is uploaded on YouTube, I'll send you the link so you could review it again, or for those who couldn't attend the live session, you can view it then. And we'll also share the slides so you can see the links and click on everything. And please feel free to contact us with any questions. So I'd like to thank Felicia, Michael, Brenci for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. This is a very interesting topic that's, I think it's applicable to people from across the disciplines because everybody writes code and it's so easy to just grab that's code that's already created. But it's really important to consider all the issues that you talked about today.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we know how important it is in an academic environment to try to keep things as open as possible and share. And I know, especially in the CS space, that a lot of journals require things be open as validating what you're reporting in a publication. So we want to make sure that our procedures align with what is happening in practice while protecting you and your research downstream. And we're happy to come talk to any individual units too, if you want to have a more in-depth discussion about any of these areas.
All right, thank you. Anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye? All right, well, go forth and open source.
Or not,
like
that's okay too.
Right? Like the proper license, right? And I just also wanted to underscore that open sourcing your license means that you are making it available for anybody to use under whatever conditions are stated in that, but that also includes commercial use. So if you don't want your software to be used for commercial use for free, and to also answer Haney's question, these are free licenses. There's no financial consideration there. So these are free, nobody's paying for them. They're free to use and anybody can exploit them commercially, given that they also look at the conditions. But these are free. If you would like to make your license available or to make your software available to your colleagues for academic research, contact Brenci or Michael, and they can actually write in academic free license language for you to use so that it's available for free for academic scientific research, but not for commercial use. So that's always an option as well.
Thanks.
All right. Well, yep. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Felicia, Brenci, Michael, for spending your hour with us. And thank you to everyone who attended and spent and asked questions. If you can think of any other questions, once we say goodbye, please feel free to email me or Felicia, Brenci, or Michael. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.